in these cases, it feels like somebody sees an opportunity to take revenge, and they're using the system to basically hurt somebody else that they felt offended them. And if you're teaching people to be victims, and if you're teaching people to view the world through these power dynamics, and if you're giving them opportunities to assert power over somebody else with these kind of tribunals, it's no surprise that people would jump on that. And I don't want to say harass, but in some cases, it feels like individuals are being harassed for political views. And welcome to the Critical Compass. On this week's episode, we are going to talk about some of the regulatory abuse in these professional organizations that issues licenses and how that affects free speech of individuals on and off of work. But first, I think I'm curious to hear, Mike, what have you watched this week? What kind of podcasts or what have you stumbled upon?
So, hi James. This week, it's been a Joe Rogan heavy week this week. Actually, I listened to just the other day, just finished the latest James Lindsay interview. I think
he's been on a few times now.
Yeah, a few times. I can't remember the last time he was on by himself, or if he was on by himself before. I know he was on with Bogosian once to talk about the grievance studies affairs, but this is the first time I've seen him on his own, and that was a really good couple hours. And then also the Riley Gaines podcast, and I don't know if one or the other came out this week. The other one has been for a couple weeks available, but
I think the James Lindsay was the most recent.
Yeah, that was a good one. They talked a lot about China. Actually, James Lindsay is writing a book on Mao right now, and how and the similarities in the American, like what Christopher Rufo would call the American cultural revolution that's happening right now, and its similarities to Maoism. That was really heavy and scary. They talked about just general regulatory capture. They talked about Boeing a lot at the end, the problems happening at Boeing. This was just, I think the recording, I think it was maybe the same day they were recording that, or just it was the day before that Boeing whistleblower conveniently suicided. Yeah,
the day before,
4 shots to the back of the head or whatever. I don't know what the actual method is going to be, but
yeah, anytime there's a death right before a testimony or hearing, that should be
in a parking lot outside of a hotel. At least try and disguise it a little bit better, guys. So yeah, it was pretty. It wasn't a very joyful listen, but it was informative nonetheless. You listened to it too, I believe, right?
Yeah, I listened to it in a couple shots. These long ones you can't quite do in one run, but
it takes a few car rides for me. Yeah,
it expands on he's. I guess he touched a little bit on his new book, The Queering of the American Child.
Right. Yes.
So that was good for him to expand on that, and also James Lindsay's really good at tying everything together. He knows the playbook so well.
Yeah.
He'll just quote. The best way to unpack this is just he's quoting the neo-Marxists, their own literature, to say, well, this is what they believe and this is what they're teaching. And I think it's a really good way to fight this, is you shine the mirror back at them and you just use their own words and their own ideas to discredit themselves. And with sunlight,
and people get really mad about that.
Well, that's why just look at how much hate libs of TikTok gets. And all that account does is just post ridiculous things.
Zero original content. It's purely reposts. Yeah. Yeah, he's got a really James Lindsay has a very like an encyclopedic mind. I don't know if that's what it's called, but he can recall quotes and authors and books and sources and essays like very, very quickly, and he knows the literature inside and out.
He treats it like a math problem.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, I remember in his interview with on Jordan Peterson's podcast, that's still to this day one of my favorite podcast episodes ever. It was so good. He credits being a math PhD with his ability to transition that into this world of into this world of DEI and modern, social equity issues, because he is able to logically kind of like parse the sources and try to grasp the logic, however faulty it may be, behind some of these actions. And like you say, he's very good at tracing the sources of things and being able to, like, it's actually wild how you don't always put these things together, but he's a very like zoom out big picture kind of guy, and he can tell you like, okay, well this is the reason why Boeing is falling apart, and it has to do with Mao. And it's like, whoa, how did you get there? But also, you're right. It's very, very strange, but very cool.
And you also mentioned, that was one of the Rogan podcasts. The other one was Riley Gaines.
Riley Gaines, the swimmer from the championship winning, award winning swimmer who Keith
had to
Olbermann
share a first place medal, first place trophy.
Do you remember Keith Olbermann back when he was on TV? When he used to be a sports broadcaster, and then he had a fairly short-lived MSNBC show before he got shit canned by MSNBC for making unlisted donations to Democratic politicians. Anyway, he tried to boom her on Twitter and claim that she was only speaking out the way she was because she was like, she never accomplished anything, and she was bitter about her lack of swimming accolades. Meanwhile, she's like, I haven't seen the video. She talks about it in the Rogan interview that she's like, she just like has a room full of trophies, and she was showing Keith Olbermann all these trophies of stuff that she's won. She broke one apparently in the process of doing it, and she was like, whatever. I don't even care. I got more where that came from. She's a very outspoken. She's worked hard for what she has, and she's very outspoken about protecting women's spaces in athletic competition, because she's unfortunately lost out on trophies and on having her name properly where it should be because of, well, primarily because of Leah Thomas, but also other transgender athletes. So that was a really good one. She's very well spoken. I think she's quite young, but she's very articulate and precise for her young years,
Yeah, and I think it sometimes takes some of these individuals with principles, with low agreeableness, to take a stand and say this is not okay. And I think Riley Gaines is a good example, because it does dovetail into some of the things that are happening in Canada. And this whole idea of like the reason why we have sex-segregated spaces is to protect women, is to give them either a fair chance to compete. So historically, there was no women's leagues for many sports. It was just the sport. And the fact that men were taller, stronger, faster just meant that they were dominating in every category. So that's why you would segregate and have a woman's only, like a female only category. To kind of dovetail this, there's been an ongoing case with a nurse in BC called Amy Hamm. And she was outspoken for a few years, even I think all the way to like 2016, fighting for dedicated female spaces, and kind of she should be one of the gender critical feminists. I think that's one of her self-described labels in that way.
Okay.
And very much speaking out against trans people invading female spaces. She wanted a clear line there. What happened in 2020 is she helped fund a billboard that says "I heart JK Rowling," and shortly thereafter, she had 2 complaints that went to the College of Nurses. So maybe I'll just pull this up.
JK Rowling, of course, the famed, internationally known transphobe, not known for anything else.
Yeah, sounds like she could be a writer, but I think she's well known as a transphobe.
That can't be. We can't prove it though.
Yeah. With that, like, this has been ongoing for almost 4 years now, and this is fascinating because this shows how much power these licensing bodies have. Like, you'll have, in this case, this is the British Columbia College of Nurses and Midwives. You also have the Board of Surgeons. You also have in each different professions. Anytime you have a license, you will have usually a non-governmental body issuing those licenses, and they have a certain amount of power to regulate conduct at work. And that makes sense because you want people to follow a code of conduct and make sure they're not doing anything that may harm the people that they work with, or that they are, if you're a nurse, you want to make sure you are caring for patients. But what that doesn't cover, and this is kind of a unique case because it's covering the free speech element, and that's outside of work. And it's quite rare for these kind of regulatory bodies to be trying to discipline people for what they say when they're not working. And let me just show you a little bit of this. 2 complaints by members of the public to the college about Mrs. Hamm's involvement with the billboard led to an investigation that resulted in a 332-page report on Mrs. Hamm's activity, including a collection of her tweets, podcast transcripts, and articles she had authored on the topic of gender identity and its conflicts with women's rights and the safeguarding of children. Problem is, this is not a topic that has a unanimous it's still very much in flux. So the fact that they are pursuing this, and they went deep, like, to make a 300-page report on that is like, this very much feels like a this is
feels like those
hunt.
Bills that they push through in like American Congress. That's like, they're so dense and heavy because they don't expect anyone to read them, and what they're trying to actually do is like hide like bylaws and stuff in broader bills and just hope that no one notices.
Yeah, it's almost like it's feels like it's just overwhelming with like, oh, these are all examples, and you could have the most benign tweets in there, and they're just trying to see like, look how terrible this person is. Yeah. But an example of one of those tweets could be like a statement like, there are only 2 biological sexes, and something like that can be deemed as hateful, transphobic. Like, it depends on who is, really depends on who is on the board, who is shining the spotlight, and who is who is deeming these hateful. The fact that it deals with the protected class means that like the bar for what is considered hate speech is a lot lower now.
Yeah.
So just as a little recap, this has been ongoing since 2020. That's when, I think it was November of 2020 was when Amy Hamm got the letter from the board, and the complaints were from September and October of 2020. The hearing began in September 21st of 2022. So it took 2 years for them to get to a point to actually start the days of testimony, 20 days of testimony. And so, as you can see, it very much feels like this is not a speedy process. This is psychological torture. And I must give credit for Amy Hamm for like standing her ground and like not caving to this. I think a lot of people would just cave and apologize and they would want it to be over and they would just give up with that amount of pressure. I want to point out a couple of these. This is Mrs. Hamm's lawyers arguing that there is no evidence of a breach of standards or bylaws. She didn't behave unprofessionally. There's no evidence that she was a terrible nurse or that she was transphobic as a nurse. This is all outside of work. Her statements do not have sufficient nexus, her status as a nurse, to warrant any interference from the board. Her speech is reasonable, scientifically supported. The issue with this is they tried to get a whole bunch of witnesses. And these are, I think, one of them was even Miriam Grossman. And these are professionals in these fields, but they kept on discrediting or preventing these witnesses from having testimonies. So there's a big fight. I think part of the reason this got delayed is that there's a lot of this, the procedural kind of back and forth and what they would allow for evidence and not, etc. Yeah. But I think it was very difficult to get any actual witnesses. They're claiming that lawyers are arguing that there's social value in speech, and considering that WPATH, the Organization for Transgender Health, has had some controversies, and there's different laws around the world. We're seeing a lot of change, and this requires open dialogue. So there is a lot of value, etc. So, yeah, does this seem like a fair use of a regulatory body?
Well, what a waste of resources and time. Like, it's just.
It's not even
how
over
nice
yet.
Is it that we have no other issues as a society that we get to spend multiple years wasting people's time on stuff like this.
Yeah, and today was the last day of testimony, and the decision will be made in 3 to 6 months, which will put it basically to the 4-year mark.
Yeah,
which is completely ridiculous. You can see, maybe we'll share. There's a recap of some of the closing statements, and Lisa Bildy, she did a great job. You can see some of her statements of like really getting to the core of why Amy Hamm should have a right to express her views and kind of how they're scientifically accurate, how they're based on logic, how it's not transphobic. But it's also worth noting who the lawyer is that's prosecuting Amy Hamm. And this is Barbara.
She looks exactly like what I thought she would.
Yeah. Barbara Findlay, an activist lawyer. So I think this is one more example of like what happens when you get people who treat their role in either a HR board or a regulatory association, or a lawyer, if they treat their role as a force for social justice.
Mm.
And
I see that right in the text. She describes herself as an activist.
Yeah, she describes herself as an activist. She literally describes herself as fat, old, white, cisgender, queer, and disabled. So even based on that, we can predict her views on a dozen other subjects just based on how she's describing herself. And she's very much describing her position within a hierarchy of oppression.
Yeah.
And whenever you have somebody who views themselves in that kind of power dynamic, it's no surprise that they would react this way to anybody calling to question the legitimacy of somebody else's status in these oppression hierarchies.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is a really good article. We will link to it in the show notes and the description. But yeah, it's a fascinating read and kind of shows to the extent that Findlay would defend some people that maybe are only being defended because of their social views, etc. So
this reminds me of one more podcast that I listened to this week. It was, and again, I don't know how recently it was, but it was Jordan Peterson's podcast where he interviews. I think the podcast was called "They Took Our Daughter," something like that. They took our child. And he interviewed. I don't know if you've listened to this one, but he interviews
a little bit
couple,
of that one. But not
interviews a couple that their daughter, 14 years old, has a history of being a storyteller, essentially, kind of an attention seeker. Peterson didn't want to diagnose her on the air, but he said he knew exactly what she should have been diagnosed with. I think it would be something like borderline personality disorder. How the family describes her sort of jives with the people I've known in my life that have that diagnosis. Just, essentially inventing stories for attention and being quite codependent, but also quite distant and quickly switching between, very, I think maybe the word is histrionic. There's also histrionic personality disorder. That might have been it. But anyway, the state of Montana essentially stole this child from her family because of all along the chain of the people that she saw were activist social workers, activist doctors, activist nurses, activist lawyers, activist judges. The family recalls that their own counsel at a hearing told them specifically that in the counsel's words, this judge is going to put you in your place because that's what she does. And so yeah, it's definitely, and probably James Lindsay actually has a lot to say about this. They may have touched on this actually in the Rogan interview about how this sort of institutional capture just is stratified through basically every layer of every institution in our society right now.
Well, you start from the universities because the university creates teachers. They create the individuals that form HR departments, they form the lawyers and judges. So if you can capture that, you've transformed everything under that, and that includes the way that children think. It's the way that people are prosecuted and people are treated in our legal systems are all going to be treated with a particular social justice lens.
Mm-hmm.
So I think James Lindsay mentioned that by the 90s, and this is kind of by the 1990s, there's been a certain amount of capture, and this was even something that these activists were bragging about, that, well, the amount of influence they had even in the 90s within the universities and within other domains.
Yeah, and he talks about that that former KGB agent that did that interview in the I don't know if it was the early 80s, maybe mid 80s, where he basically described the same phenomenon, that like this is the playbook, this is how you demoralize a nation, and this is what the KGB specifically had been working to implement in various enemy states throughout the world. So
yeah, describing that it doesn't happen right away. It takes multiple generations, but if you transform, if you capture the kids, if you plant the seeds of these ideas within a few generations, you've overhauled a society. So
it's brilliant, and its deviousness.
Yeah, I guess to control the present, you would capture present institutions, but to control the future, you get the children. So
when their heads are nice and soft, and that's what Lindsay also talked about. He's talked about it at length in other interviews and in his writings, but that's essentially what they did, what Mao did in China with the Red Guard. And do you know what happened to the Red Guard after he gained power the second time? Oh, sorry, you're too radical. You need to be disposed of. So the very young people that he used to overthrow the current leaders and power structure to get himself inserted into it, well, as soon as they were done, as soon as that was achieved, they were of no use to him and actually were a threat to him. So he just disposed of them, which is what will happen now too.
To recap, to bring in a revolution, you need destabilizing forces. But after the change is made, anybody part of destabilization is a threat, because you don't want to destabilize once you've installed
what you've built. Yeah, that's right.
What you've built, yeah. You just want to destabilize what came before you.
Yeah. It's the fundamental. I can't remember who was talking about this, but this was another maybe podcast interview where they talked about the fundamental difference between progressives and conservatives, and how growing up as a young liberal in the city, I always thought of the liberals as the hopeful, the ones who were changing wanted to mold a better future, and conservatives as like stodgy old men in business suits who wanted to preserve their wealth and not have it, which is a stereotype of maybe like early 2000s, mid 2000s neocons. But what this person was saying was that actually, if you think about it, a progressive is actually never, like by their very own definition of their politics, they're never actually truly happy with the state of the world. They're always wanting to change it and form it into something else because it's not sufficient. It's not good the way it is. It needs to be something else. Whereas a conservative actually likes the current state of, whatever particular area of the world they're in, and they want to conserve it because they see value in it. So that kind of changed my opinion of what it means to be on either end of the political spectrum. And I kind of get, if you want to call it conservative, that you want to preserve certain traditions and institutions that are in fact valuable and effective. Well, if that's conservative, then there isn't necessarily anything stodgy or, dusty and miserable about that. That's actually quite positive.
Well, I believe Jordan Peterson's written about this a little bit, and he's talked about it as well. But there's two ways that you can think about it. Is you can think of it on the political, like the social dynamic of there's a constant conversation between like conservatism of wanting to preserve the structures that have built everything that we have now, and this kind of creative reforming energy that wants to think about, well, how can we change this, and how can we make a different or better world. But he also talks about that every liberal should strive to build a world worth conserving. Because if you're always changing and you're always reforming and you have no stability, like that's where things kind of fall apart. If you're in a constant state of like change, what's the difference between just reform and progress and destabilization? Because that line gets very tricky at some points. And I think even that's on the societal level. But I think within our minds, you could draw a parallel to, we've got established ways of thinking. You have established ideas. You have habits. You have things that your brain wants to conserve, or a way of thinking that you want to conserve. And then you have these new ideas, this creative element of thinking about, well, what can be done differently? And I think there's a push-pull in every individual as well as on the societal level. And I don't know if we give enough credit to like fostering, how do you foster a healthy push-pull between these two dynamics?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's maybe a good topic for a full-length episode one day.
Yeah, I'd love to dive into that further. But I guess the pillar of this is having free speech is what enables us to have that push-pull.
Yeah.
But with cases like Amy Hamm's, even if she's completely, she comes out of this and she gets an apology, etc. I even the painful nature of it taking 4 years can have a chilling effect on individuals staying quiet and not wanting to speak up, on threat of kind of having the regulatory body diving and chasing them and giving them a hard time.
Well, especially anyone who belongs to any sort of professional association, which have all been captured by these activists again, you know, who aren't doing what their jobs are supposed to be, but they're trying to use their, you know, little, what do they call it? Like, you know, you're a king of a molehill, or so, you know what I mean? Like your own little private tiny kingdom. They're trying to be, you know, world builders from a HR cubicle, and it's just ruining people's lives.
These are people who only view the world through power, asserting power in their small domain.
Yeah, yeah.
And the problem is, these regulatory bodies seem to speak quite confidently on, like, these are the guidelines we've set, or these are the things that are true. And often they are just proclaimed to be true from some other authority.
Yeah, and you're supposed to just take them as self-evident, though.
You saw this a lot in during COVID with the lockdowns and all the recommendations. You have something mentioned by the WHO, and then that is adopted as like a legitimate truth, and that is what was followed and disseminated down from there. And then you couldn't argue against it because they say, well, this is what these guidelines are. And then they would say, well, who are you to challenge this? And in the cases of this, you had all kinds of scientists and researchers and doctors from different disciplines disagreeing with this and being raked over the coals in various cases.
Perfect segue to our next topic. A Mrs. Kulvinder Kaur and a Mr. J. Bhattacharya and his Great Barrington Declaration, correct? Am I on the right track, James?
Yes. So some of you may have seen Kulvinder on Twitter just sharing. During the lockdown, she was pretty much every day just sharing the information, what she could, on trying to rebalance and get some sanity back into the situation. And she was speaking out very, very early. And I'm going to play a little bit of this short clip, because right now she is crowdfunding.
How much? Where do you stand now?
I've now been ordered to pay nearly $300,000 in the cost order. And I have mere weeks to pay. So my deadline is at the end of March. And it's $300,000 that I don't have after nearly 4 years of being entangled in multiple legal battles, trying to advocate for my patients, trying to advocate for Canadians, and to try to advocate for myself. And so it's now looking quite grim.
So what happens then? I mean, if you can't pay the order, you probably have to declare bankruptcy, I would think. What will that do to your ability to practice medicine? What will that do to your ability to care for your patients?
It's all very daunting right now, and I never thought that this would be the cost of speaking truth to power, of being compelled to speak my conscience, being compelled to speak against the harms that I knew were going to happen against the people within the very communities that I practice within the developing world, where I initially was born and still have very deep roots too.
So yeah, right now she's on the hook for $300,000. And
this is like her legal bills, or is this a penalty that she's been ordered to pay?
This is, I think these are okay. I'll just show this here.
Cost order, pre-tribunal, pretrial procedural ruling against her has led to a cost order of up to $1.2 million. The court procedural motion decision and the cost order were both appealed, ultimately leading to a cost order of nearly $300,000.
Yeah, so this is just another example of this would fall under the category of lawfare, of like if not, even without these kind of fees, for somebody to defend themselves, minimum a small trial is like 15 grand, even on like some of these small court cases. Like you can spend a lot of money, and some of these, they think about how many days, and if you have somebody on retainer, and like these costs can just destroy somebody's life. They can destroy somebody's life.
Shout out to Conrad Graff with his $1,000 donation. Holy smokes.
Yeah. I think they're up to 100,000 right now.
Yeah, good.
She is not the only one being put into this kind of situation. And these are for things that have later, a lot of these cases, like speaking out about lockdowns or giving exemptions for the COVID shots or any number of these things. At the time, they were being punished for something at the time, which later the evidence has changed. So,
yeah,
some of these cases have been thrown out, but the people have been still left with legal bills. So, any case where you have, like, some of these are regulatory bodies, some of these are against the government, and anytime you're up against the government, even these regulatory bodies, they tend to have a deep pocket of money set aside for legal, like their legal battles, or funding any courts, or if they're basically crowdfunded for all their members who have to pay a certain annual fee to get their licenses, they have infinitely more money than the individuals that they are harassing with these kind of legal battles. And then anytime you're up against the government, they have nearly endless resources. And even if you get something dismissed, if you're still left on the hook for that. So, and that's on set trials, and that's not even speaking anything about these kind of, any of these tribunals that don't follow these same kind of structures as these, any of these court cases. So I know we're kind of blending a few things together, because I know these regulatory bodies, they work a little bit differently than just being sued outright. And
well, there's just so many fun regulatory bodies that we have to deal with, right, James?
Yeah, all we need is just another 4 or 5 new regulatory bodies just to get more options.
Yeah.
So last week's episode, we were talking about Bill C-63, and with anonymous reporting, how that would supercharge that could supercharge abuse of kind of vindictive complaints against individuals for something that maybe really doesn't fit the category of detestable, hateful language. So I think the reason that they claim that you have to protect individuals because they would be singled out, or there may be harm against them if they were not anonymous, which in some cases you could see that, but the fact that a lot of them can stay anonymous, I think, supercharges this abuse. And you have a little bit more knowledge on, like, or I guess a question for you is, like, what's a major difference of these human rights tribunals versus just like a court of law?
Well, from my understanding, I mean, a human rights tribunal can, first of all, it can mean any of 100 things. I mean, these are often populated by sometimes even just regular, like, uncredentialed citizens who happen to be involved in an organization and like employed by an organization in a certain capacity. But oftentimes you'll see board members, HR members, people who administrative workers of certain organizations or boards who have been either volunteered or have been told that they are to participate on a panel of, adjudicating on such and such issue on the behest of the regulations or the code of conduct of certain professional organizations or groups. It reminds me of the situation that Jordan Peterson finds himself in now with the Ontario College of Psychologists. These are psychologists, you would hope. There's probably some administrative staff involved as well, who essentially have determined that he needs to be re-educated in his social media usage. Otherwise, he brings the profession into disrepute. And so they can still issue judgments that have very far-reaching consequences for the individuals that they are targeting.
And even finding yourself subjected to a human rights tribunal, the social cost and employment cost, and even if you're found, it's like, not guilty by this tribunal, like, you carry a certain baggage with you. And this can be a low cost complaint with a high either procedural harm. Like, the damages of somebody going through months getting put through the ringer, the stress of this proceeding, like that, and the social cost after, like, it's hard to get that off of your name afterwards. Even if they are not criminally charged with something, I think the harms are numerous.
Well, it's kind of things. And it's sort of I think the phrase we were saying before we hit record here that you said, the process is the punishment, right?
Yeah.
Whether or not that comes with a financial or a professional cost, there is, yeah, like you say, I mean, okay, well, now I have to waste, if I want to keep my license or I want to keep my certification in such and such a field, and I have to subject myself to months of this garbage, being torn apart publicly by these people who, have no right to be doing so. It's crazy. I hate it so much.
Yeah, it's with the way that some of the decisions have, like, in prior Canadian history, like, certain cases have gone through, and it's not making me feel confident about how individuals are going to be treated for hate speech under Bill C-63. And it feels like comedians are often the targets of these because they're the ones trying to find the edges of acceptable discourse.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Oftentimes, comedians are the only people truly speaking truth to power in that way. So this is actually just a recent decision by the Supreme Court. Actually, this is an older article because I believe that something more recently happened, something more recent than 2021. But Mike Ward, so in a comedy set, made fun of this disabled Quebecois singer, Jeremy Gabriel, and I'll scroll down a bit here because this was in 2012, I think. 2012, I think, is when the joke was told. This would be Mike Ward. And then in 2016, a tribunal ruled in Gabriel's favor, awarding him $25,000 for moral damages and another $10,000 for punitive damages. Gabriel's mother was awarded $5,000 for moral damages and another $2,000 for punitive. Ward appealed, and in 2019, a Quebec Court of Appeal ruled in a 2-1 decision that Ward's comments compromised the young performer's right to safeguard of his dignity and could not be justified even in a society where freedom of expression is valued. So there's perfect double speech.
So
double speak.
Just for those who aren't up to speed, does moral damages just mean hurt feelings?
I think essentially that's a fun legalese way of saying hurt feelings. Thankfully, the appeal court did, however, roll back the payments to Gabriel's mother. But the Supreme Court decision, which apparently happened in 2021, in a 5-4 split decision, so it's not even close to being... It was very close. The top court ruled Friday that while comedian Mike Ward's act ridiculed Jeremy Gabriel, he was chosen as a target not because of his disability, but because of his fame. So even then, that's a really, really weak justification for, hey, you know what? We're still allowed to tell jokes as a society. So yeah, it's that was a fun one.
Yeah, it's
you had a comedian you want to talk about too.
Yeah, this is I think a little bit earlier. We'll just pull up the National Post. There's a comedian called Guy Earle, and during a set, there were 2 lesbians making out and shouting obscenities and heckling during a set, and they got into an argument. And I think he, like a lot of comedians, as you play the crowd and you make fun of those who are heckling you, he targeted them and mentioned them being lesbians, and that started an exchange. What it ended up escalating to is that after the show, I think they followed him down, and they were continuing to argue, and the woman who was suing him threw water into his face, and he smacked her sunglasses off onto the ground. So this doesn't seem so one-sided. It's not like he went out there just to find the only lesbian in the crowd and target her. So ultimately, the BC Human Rights Tribunal ordered Guy Earle to pay $15,000 for lasting physical and psychological effect, for basically post-traumatic stress disorder. And so that's no small chunk of change. He tried to appeal it and didn't stick. So I think he's doing okay now. He recently wrote a book. So he wrote a book called Cancelled: The Death of Stand-Up. Proceeds go to hecklers with PTSD. So glad to see that he's taking it and like, well, obviously he's gonna be silly about it, but he's so yeah, that's Guy Earle. Sounds like he's trying to make light of just, well,
he's a good sport.
Free speech. Yeah, he's a good sport about his free speech case. And these are just examples of what happens when you have, in these cases, it feels like somebody sees an opportunity to take revenge, and they're using the system to basically hurt somebody else that they felt offended them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if you're teaching people to be victims, and if you're teaching people to view the world through these power dynamics, and if you're giving them opportunities to assert power over somebody else with these kind of tribunals, it's no surprise that people would jump on that. And I don't want to say harass, but in some cases, it feels like individuals are being harassed for political views that, like a comedian's making a joke, they're at a show, you're supposed to make a joke. In other cases,
you're supposed to know that you, by being there, make yourself a possible target for a joke, which is supposed to be taken in good fun. You're supposed to be a certain type of personality that can go to a comedy show and take a little back and forth from the guy on stage.
Yeah, and the other thing is, if you are heckling and then you're defiantly destructing, don't expect any kindness from somebody. Like, it's difficult to be a comedian, as difficult to have your flow interrupted in something that's not supposed to be a back and forth between the audience, unless a comedian specifically requests a back and forth. So,
unless you're Matt Rife, specifically making TikTok content of crowd work, it's not a participatory exercise.
Yeah, and
also, what a stupid target to try and pick anyone other than a comedian who can absolutely destroy you with wit very quickly if you're gonna heckle.
Yeah. Generally, you're not gonna come out on top. Like, you're not gonna.
No. You're not gonna come out looking like the good guy.
You're also not gonna get the last word because they literally have a mic. So.
Yeah. Well, this, I don't know, James, if you've watched this, or rather listened to this podcast, The Witch Trials of JK Rowling.
No, this is new to me.
It's very, very good. I think it came out around this time last year. I think February of last year. And it's by the Free Press. It's produced by the Free Press. I think it was their first actual podcast production. And it's a very, very good, I think it's an 8-part series that I'll read about. The Witch Trials of JK Rowling is an audio documentary that examines some of the most contentious conflicts of our time through the life and career of the world's most successful author. In conversation with host Megan Phelps Roper, JK Rowling speaks with unprecedented candor about the depths, or candor and depth about the controversy surrounding her, from book bans to debates on gender and sex. The series also examines the forces propelling this moment in history through interviews with Rowling supporters and critics, journalists, historians, clinicians, and more. And if I'm right, it says it down here. Megan Phelps Roper was actually raised in the Westboro Baptist Church, so she has experience with being involved in groupthink cults. Yes, so it was a really, really good series. I think it's 8 episodes. She interviews Rowling herself as well as some critics. ContraPoints, the very famous YouTube transgender commentator, is also featured in a couple episodes, and overall it was a really balanced. I felt it was a very balanced series. It kind of explored both, Rowling's true kind of. It let her say in her own words essentially why she's doing what she's doing now, and why she believes what she believes, and why she's so vehement about it. And it also, has some good questions, put on her about, her sort of activism in this space, in this kind of latter part of her career.
Yeah, that's definitely one to check out. I would love to listen to that further, and we'll add a link below as well. I guess that raises the question of why do you care? Why do we care about any of this? Why can't you just let people live their lives? And for JK Rowling to pretty much, she could just do her thing. She has all the wealth in the world, and she could just be quiet about this issue. Like there's nothing to gain. She's not going to get more famous. She's already famous. She's not going to receive
She's already
extra
wealthier
love.
than God.
Like, yeah. Like, here's the thing. Like she wrote a beloved book series, and before this was quite universally beloved by everybody. There is nothing for her to gain to stick her neck out and take a stance here. She's only going to receive pushback because when she started sharing these thoughts, this was not during a time where, there we go.
She, in fact, just tweeted about it today. Why? Why do you care? The number of people who feel compelled to tell me that if they had my money, they wouldn't give a damn about the rights of women and children never ceases to amaze me. I believe you, of course. I'm just surprised that's something you'd like to boast about. With precision, she gets right to the heart of that. It's almost like she's a very, very good, very accomplished writer, and it's very unlikely that you will ever outmaneuver her in a battle of wits.
She reminds me of Jordan Peterson in the way that, like, they seem very. Jordan Peterson mentions that, like, especially when he's being grilled by journalists, he says, like, I choose my words very, very carefully.
Yeah.
And anybody who's a writer is like, especially if they take a time to like pause in an interview, or they're not just running their mouth. They are like, well, here's what I believe. Here's the principles behind it. Here's the rationale. Here's the logic. And they're being very precise about it. So,
yeah, which is, I feel, part of the, it's a concept that a lot of people who are on, say, the more progressive, self-described progressive, end of the spectrum don't really understand, because this was Michael Malice who said that leftists, at least a modern day conception of leftists, they don't use language to communicate, they use language to manipulate. So a lot of these people who willingly insert themselves into these spaces and have these debates and have these shouting matches with people who are much, much more intelligent than them online, I don't think they can truly understand that concept, that, being able to actually use language and words in a way to convey, try and become closer to reality, try to move closer to the truth of a situation, because they only view what they're saying and what they're doing as being something in service of a movement or of an ideology, rather than language and communication unto itself. Maybe something like that.
So what that means is, when you are arguing with these people, you're not arguing with their thought process. You are arguing with the ideology. And if anything, they have memorized the top 5 things to counter. You'll ask them this and they'll say that. They've got it ready. And when they run out of their list of rebuttals, or if you try to pin them down on the actual logic behind something, that's where you see
on a definition.
Yeah, they fumble with the actual definitions. They're not taught how to think, they're taught what to think. They'll struggle in actually trying to navigate the base level to some of these concepts, or they've made the definitions fit the ideology, rather than using definitions as a way to better describe and navigate the world.
Yeah.
So it's a conclusion first approach, rather than like the scientific process of, like, you make observations, you try to define the world, make observations, you put a framework, and then you see if that framework actually can predict anything, or if it maps onto reality. And if it doesn't, you revise it until you get closer and closer. And that takes constant pushing and probing into that framework to see if it's actually true or not. But right now, I don't think people are really gunning for truth. I think they believe they know what truth is, and they believe they're right. And I must give them credit for, like, well, they're reacting exactly how you'd expect somebody to react if they were given a divine truth and told that they are morally righteous to spread this truth and fight for this truth, but they're not given that hardware to question their own truth. So that's more of a cult dynamic at that point.
That seems like a great place to end it.
Yeah, I would say that's a good
We've solved
good place
it.
to wrap up. We've solved it yet again. It's just like that the episode we did on Palestine. You're like, well, I think you've taught me everything we need to know.
Yep.
You just
And
summed it
that's
up
why
there.
when that episode released, that's why all the fighting stopped.
It's like, maybe
You did
we
it.
need another 4 hours on that episode to really dive in.
Well, I think that's something that we can do, and I think we touched on a lot of things today, actually, that we will certainly expand on in full format episodes. But this has been a really good chat this week, and an otherwise kind of a quiet week. Actually, nothing particularly earth-shattering happened this week, but I think we got some good content out of what did. It was a good chat.
Yeah, I guess not that every week has to be like, we don't need the shiny new object for us to.
Yeah, we're not
attention.
CNN
Like
24-hour news cycle here.
I guess to sum up this week, there's plenty of things that are worth some attention and worth diving into. So that was a good chat. And I think these things will be things we touch upon again in one form or another, because this free speech standpoint informs everything. That's how our whole society functions. Without free speech, we don't have a democratic process. We don't have function. We don't have people expressing. We don't have the growth. We just have domination in some form or another. So
yeah, you and me aren't allowed to do this.
Yeah, it's just think about how much we're able to, like, the process of us thinking about these things, and we're hoping, like, our viewers, that everybody watching, that you on this path too, you're thinking about things that you haven't thought about, because by diving into this, forces you to think. And I think that's what we need more of. So
awesome. Thank you as always, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. And we'll see you again next week.
Always a pleasure. Okay, have a good week. Chat soon.